The case of Juana Barraza, the wrestler who killed grandmothers. In the sprawling metropolis of Mexico City, where millions of people live in anonymity and the elderly often exist forgotten in cramped apartments, a predator stalked the streets with a face that no one would suspect. By day, she was known as La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence, a professional wrestler who entertained crowds with her athletic prowess and theatrical performances. But behind the mask and costume of this seemingly harmless entertainer lurked one of Mexico's most prolific serial killers. Juana Barraza Samperio didn't look like a monster. She was a stocky, middle-aged woman with calloused hands and a weathered face that spoke of a life filled with hard work and struggle. To her neighbors, she was a devoted mother, trying to make ends meet through wrestling and odd jobs. To the elderly women she targeted, she appeared to be a kind social worker or nurse, offering help and companionship. But between 1998 and 2006, Barraza systematically murdered at least 42 elderly women, earning her the nickname that would haunt Mexico City's collective memory, the Little Old Lady Killer. What made Barraza's crimes particularly chilling was not just their number, but the calculated way she exploited the trust and vulnerability of her victims. She preyed on women who were often forgotten by society, elderly widows living alone, pensioners struggling with poverty, grandmothers whose families visited rarely, if ever. These women welcomed Barraza into their homes because she represented exactly what they needed most. Someone who cared about their welfare and offered practical help with their daily struggles. But Barraza's apparent kindness was a carefully constructed facade that concealed a rage so deep and twisted that it could only be satisfied by the systematic destruction of the most vulnerable members of society. Her victims trusted her because she seemed to understand their loneliness, their fears, and their desperate need for human connection. Instead, they found themselves face to face with a killer whose own traumatic past had transformed her into something monstrous. The story of Juana Barraza is not just the tale of a serial killer, but a window into the complex factors that can transform a victim of abuse into a perpetrator of unimaginable violence. It's a story about poverty, abandonment, sexual trauma, and the way that society's failures can create monsters who then prey on society's most vulnerable members. Juana Barraza Samperio was born on December 27, 1957, in the rural village of Epazoyucan, in the state of Hidalgo, Mexico, where poverty was as common as the dust that covered the unpaved roads and adobe houses. Her early years were marked by the kind of abandonment and abuse that would shape her into something dangerous, though thousands of children endured similar hardships without becoming killers. Her mother, Justa Samperio, was an alcoholic who struggled with mental illness and had little capacity for nurturing or protecting her children. Juana never knew her father, and her mother was often too drunk or too unstable to provide even the most basic care. The household was chaotic and violent, with Justa bringing home a series of men who showed little interest in the children and sometimes actively abused them. When Juana was 12 years old, her mother made a decision that would haunt her daughter for the rest of her life. Desperate for money to buy alcohol and unable to care for her children, Justa sold Juana to a man named José Lugo for the equivalent of 3 beers. The transaction was presented as an informal adoption, but everyone involved understood that Juana was being sold into sexual slavery. José Lugo was a middle-aged man who had specifically sought out a young girl for his own twisted purposes. He took Juana to Mexico City, where he kept her as a virtual prisoner in a small apartment, subjecting her to years of systematic sexual abuse while forcing her to work as a domestic servant. Juana was told that she now belonged to Lugo, that her mother had willingly given her away, and that no one would ever come looking for her. The psychological damage inflicted during these formative years was profound and lasting. Juana learned that women, particularly older women like her mother, could not be trusted, that they would sacrifice their own children for their own selfish needs. She also learned that she was powerless, that her body was not her own, and that survival depended on her ability to endure whatever abuse was inflicted upon her. When Juana was 16, she became pregnant by her abuser. Lugo was furious about the pregnancy and beat her severely, hoping to cause a miscarriage. When that failed, he abandoned her on the streets of Mexico City, leaving her homeless and pregnant with no money, no family, and no skills beyond the domestic work she had been forced to perform. The birth of her son marked a turning point in Juana's life, though not necessarily a positive one. She was determined to be a better mother than her own had been, but she had no model for healthy parenting and no support system to help her navigate the challenges of raising a child while living in extreme poverty. She worked a series of menial jobs, cleaning houses, selling food on the street, doing laundry. But the money was never enough to provide the kind of life she wanted for her son. It was during this period that Juana discovered professional wrestling, a sport that would provide her with both an outlet for her rage and a means of supporting her family. Wrestling offered her something she had never experienced before, a sense of power and control, the ability to physically dominate others, and the admiration of crowds who cheered for her performances. The transformation from victim to predator was gradual but inexorable, shaped by years of accumulated rage and a twisted psychology that blamed elderly women for all the suffering she had endured. Juana's entry into the world of professional wrestling in the early 1990s provided her with more than just a source of income. It gave her a new identity and a socially acceptable outlet for the violence that had been building inside her for decades. Wrestling allowed her to transform her pain into power, her victimization into dominance, and her helplessness into control over others. She adopted the ring name La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence, a moniker that would prove prophetic given the quiet, methodical way she would later stalk and kill her victims. In the ring, Juana was known for her aggressive style and her ability to absorb punishment while continuing to fight. Fans appreciated her toughness and her willingness to engage in the theatrical violence that made wrestling so popular among Mexico City's working-class audiences. But wrestling was more than just entertainment for Juana. It was therapy, a way of working through her trauma by inflicting controlled violence on willing participants. The physical training required for wrestling also gave her the strength and skills that would later make her such an effective killer. She learned how to use her body as a weapon, how to overpower opponents who might be larger or stronger, and how to maintain her composure during violent confrontations. The wrestling community provided Juana with a sense of belonging that she had never experienced before. Her fellow wrestlers accepted her as one of their own, and fans cheered for her performances without knowing anything about her troubled past. For the first time in her life, she was valued for her strength rather than exploited for her vulnerability. However, the financial rewards of wrestling were modest, and Juana struggled to support herself and her growing family. She had married and had additional children, but her relationships were often troubled and unstable. The trauma of her childhood had left her unable to form healthy emotional connections, and she often found herself in relationships with men who were abusive or exploitative. It was during this period of financial stress and emotional instability that Juana began to develop the psychological framework that would later justify her crimes. She had always harbored deep resentment toward her mother for selling her into abuse. But this anger began to expand to include elderly women in general. In her twisted logic, older women represented everything that was wrong with the world. They were selfish, uncaring, and willing to sacrifice the young and vulnerable for their own comfort. Juana's first known murder occurred in 1998, though investigators believe she may have been killing for some time before that, without the crimes being connected to a single perpetrator. The victim was Carmen Camila Gonzalez, a 64-year-old widow who lived alone in a modest apartment in Mexico City's Doctores neighborhood. The murder followed a pattern that would become Juana's signature. She approached the elderly woman while disguised as a social worker or nurse, gained entry to the victim's home by offering help with government benefits or medical care, and then strangled her victim with whatever was available, usually a stethoscope, telephone cord, or piece of clothing. What made Juana particularly effective as a killer was her ability to present herself as exactly what her victims needed most. Elderly women living alone in Mexico City faced numerous challenges, navigating bureaucratic systems to receive their pensions, accessing medical care, dealing with repairs and maintenance in their homes. When a seemingly official person appeared at their door, offering help with these problems, most victims welcomed her inside without suspicion. Juana's appearance also worked in her favor. She was a middle-aged woman with a maternal demeanor who dressed conservatively and spoke politely. She carried official-looking documents and identification that appeared legitimate to elderly people who might not be familiar with current bureaucratic procedures. Most importantly, she seemed to genuinely care about her victims' welfare, asking about their health, their families, and their daily struggles. The psychological manipulation that preceded each murder was as important as the physical act itself. Juana would spend time with her victims, listening to their stories, expressing sympathy for their problems, and building the kind of trust that elderly people desperately craved. She understood that loneliness was often more painful than physical ailments, and she exploited this emotional vulnerability with the skill of a trained psychologist. But beneath this facade of caring concern was a calculating predator who was studying her victims for signs of weakness and vulnerability. Juana would note whether the victim lived alone, whether they had regular visitors, whether they were physically frail enough to be easily overpowered. She would also look for valuable items that could be stolen after the murder, though robbery was always secondary to the psychological satisfaction she derived from killing. The actual murders were quick and efficient, reflecting Juana's physical strength and her experience with violence from her wrestling career. She would wait until her victim was relaxed and trusting, then attack without warning, using her hands or whatever was available to strangle them. The victims rarely had time to scream or call for help, and their deaths were often not discovered for days or weeks. After each murder, Juana would carefully stage the scene to make it appear that the victim had died of natural causes or had been killed during a robbery. She would steal small items of value, jewelry, cash, electronics, but she was careful not to take anything that would be immediately missed or that could be easily traced back to her. The psychological satisfaction that Juana derived from these murders was complex and deeply rooted in her traumatic past. Each elderly woman she killed represented her mother, the woman who had abandoned and betrayed her when she was most vulnerable. The murders allowed her to reverse the power dynamic of her childhood, transforming her from victim to victimizer, from powerless child to dominant adult. By 2003, Mexico City police had begun to recognize that they were dealing with a serial killer, though the investigation was hampered by several factors that worked in Juana's favor. The victims were often elderly women whose deaths might naturally be attributed to age or illness. The crime scenes were carefully staged to obscure evidence of murder, and the killer's appearance and methods didn't match any of the profiles that investigators had developed. The media dubbed the unknown killer El Mataviejitas, the little old lady killer, and the case became a sensation in Mexico City's newspapers and television programs. The public was fascinated and horrified by the idea that someone was systematically targeting the city's most vulnerable residents, and pressure mounted on police to solve the case quickly. But the investigation was complicated by the fact that many of the victims came from marginalized communities where police presence was minimal and trust in law enforcement was low. Families often didn't report their elderly relatives missing for days or weeks, and when bodies were discovered, the crime scenes had often been contaminated or disturbed. The psychological profile developed by investigators was initially completely wrong, reflecting biases and assumptions that actually helped Juana avoid detection. Police assumed that the killer was a young man, possibly someone with medical training, who could gain access to elderly victims by posing as a healthcare worker. They focused their investigation on male suspects and largely ignored the possibility that the killer might be a woman. This gender bias was reinforced by the assumption that women were not capable of the kind of sustained violence that characterized these murders. The idea that a middle-aged female wrestler could be systematically killing elderly women was so far outside investigators' expectations that they dismissed early tips and evidence that might have led them to Juana sooner. The breakthrough in the case came almost by accident in January 2006, when Juana was caught leaving the scene of her final murder. She had just killed Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro, an 82-year-old former schoolteacher, when a neighbor spotted her leaving the victim's apartment building. The neighbor, suspicious of the woman's behavior and appearance, followed her and called police. When officers arrived, they found Juana walking calmly down the street, carrying a bag that contained items stolen from the victim's apartment. Her demeanor was so normal and unthreatening that the arresting officers initially assumed they had made a mistake. It seemed impossible that this ordinary-looking middle-aged woman could be the serial killer who had terrorized Mexico City for nearly a decade. But the evidence was overwhelming. The stolen items in Juana's possession were clearly identifiable as belonging to the murder victim, and forensic analysis would later link her to multiple crime scenes through fingerprints, DNA evidence, and witness testimony. More importantly, once in custody, Juana began to confess to her crimes with a matter-of-fact calm that chilled even experienced investigators. The confessions that followed revealed the full scope of Juana's crimes and provided insights into the twisted psychology that had driven her to kill. She admitted to murdering at least 42 elderly women, though investigators suspected the actual number might be higher. She described her methods in clinical detail, showing no remorse for her victims and no understanding of why her actions were considered wrong by society. What was most disturbing about Juana's confessions was the casual way she described her victims' deaths. She spoke about murdering elderly women the way someone else might describe their daily work routine, showing no emotional connection to the lives she had taken or the families she had destroyed. The women she killed were not human beings to her. They were simply objects that had served a purpose in working through her own psychological trauma. The trial of Juana Barraza was one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in Mexican history, drawing international attention to issues of violence against the elderly and the complex factors that can create serial killers. The courtroom was packed with family members of victims, journalists from around the world, and members of the public who wanted to see the face of the woman who had terrorized their city. What they saw was profoundly disappointing and disturbing in equal measure. Juana appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary middle-aged woman who looked like she might work in a shop or clean houses. There was nothing in her appearance that suggested the monster she had become. Nothing that would have warned her victims of the danger they were in when they opened their doors to her. Throughout the trial, Juana showed little emotion as prosecutors described her crimes in graphic detail. She sat quietly, occasionally taking notes or whispering to her court-appointed attorneys, but never displaying any sign of remorse or recognition of the enormity of what she had done. The contrast between her unremarkable appearance and the horrific nature of her crimes was almost impossible for observers to process. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Carlos Mendoza, faced the challenging task of presenting evidence for dozens of separate murders while maintaining the jury's attention and emotional equilibrium. The scope of Juana's crimes was so vast that it was difficult to comprehend as the work of a single individual rather than some kind of organized criminal enterprise. Juana's defense team attempted to argue that their client was mentally ill and therefore not fully responsible for her actions. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about her traumatic childhood, her history of abuse, and her apparent disconnection from normal human emotions and moral reasoning. They argued that the sexual abuse she had suffered as a child had damaged her psychologically to the point where she could not distinguish right from wrong. But the prosecution's psychiatric experts painted a very different picture of the defendant. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a forensic psychiatrist with decades of experience evaluating violent criminals, testified that while Juana certainly had significant psychological problems, she was not legally insane. Her crimes showed too much planning, too much awareness of right and wrong, and too much effort to avoid detection for her to claim that she did not understand what she was doing. This is not a woman who lost touch with reality, Dr. Hernandez explained to the jury. This is a woman who understood exactly what she was doing and chose to do it anyway. Her ability to maintain her cover as a wrestler and ordinary citizen, to plan her crimes carefully and to avoid capture for years, demonstrates that she was fully aware of the nature and consequences of her actions. The families of Juana's victims struggled to understand how someone who looked so harmless could have caused so much pain. Many of them had spent years searching for answers about their loved ones' deaths, never knowing that they had fallen victim to a predator who had turned murder into a way of working through her own psychological trauma. When Juana took the stand to testify in her own defense, she spoke in the same calm, measured voice that had once convinced dozens of elderly women to trust her with their lives. She showed no remorse for her victims, no understanding of the pain she had caused their families, and no recognition that she had done anything particularly wrong. When asked why she had killed so many innocent women, Juana gave rambling, incoherent explanations about feeling angry at elderly women who reminded her of her mother, about wanting to punish people who had abandoned their responsibilities to the young, and about feeling powerful when she took control of other people's lives. But underneath all the elaborate justifications and pseudo-psychological explanations, the truth was much simpler and more terrifying. She had killed because it made her feel better about her own traumatic past. The verdict was never really in doubt. The evidence against Juana was overwhelming, and her own detailed confessions had sealed her fate. She was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to 759 years in prison, though under Mexican law she would be eligible for parole after serving 50 years. The psychological evaluation of Juana Barraza that was conducted after her conviction revealed a mind that was both calculating and completely damaged by childhood trauma. Dr. Maria Gonzalez, who spent months interviewing her in prison, found herself confronting a level of psychological dysfunction that challenged her understanding of human nature and forced her to question many of her assumptions about the relationship between victimization and violence. What made Juana particularly disturbing was not just her complete lack of remorse for her crimes, but her inability to understand why her actions were considered wrong by society. She could recite moral principles and explain why murder was illegal, but she felt no emotional connection to these concepts. To her, killing elderly women was simply something that made her feel better, like other people might feel better after exercising or eating their favorite food. Barraza represents a complete failure of the normal human capacity for empathy, Dr. Gonzalez wrote in her comprehensive report. She is capable of mimicking normal emotional responses when it serves her purposes, but she feels nothing genuine toward other human beings. They exist in her mind solely as objects that can either help or harm her psychological state. During their sessions together, Juana was cooperative and even friendly, answering Dr. Gonzalez's questions with apparent honesty and showing genuine interest in the psychological evaluation process. But the psychiatrist quickly realized that this cooperation was just another form of manipulation. Juana was studying her reactions, trying to figure out what she wanted to hear, and adjusting her responses accordingly. The most chilling aspect of Juana's psychology was her view of her victims. She didn't see them as human beings with their own hopes, fears, dreams, and families. They were simply representations of her mother, objects that allowed her to repeatedly act out her revenge against the woman who had abandoned and betrayed her. When Dr. Gonzalez asked her about specific victims, she could remember details about their deaths with perfect clarity, but she showed no emotional response to these memories. Juana's relationship with her own children was particularly revealing and disturbing. She spoke about them with genuine affection and claimed that everything she had done was motivated by her desire to provide for them. But she showed no understanding of how her actions might have affected them, no recognition that having a serial killer for a mother might be traumatic for children trying to build their own lives. Perhaps most disturbing of all was Juana's complete lack of understanding about why her crimes had caused such widespread public outrage and fear. She genuinely seemed to believe that she had been providing some kind of service to society by removing what she saw as useless or burdensome individuals. The elderly women she had killed were, in her view, people whose deaths shouldn't matter to anyone and whose absence wouldn't be noticed or mourned. Dr. Gonzalez concluded that there was absolutely no possibility of rehabilitation for someone like Juana Barraza. Her lack of empathy and remorse wasn't something that could be treated, cured, or modified through therapy or medication. It was a fundamental part of who she was as a person. She would always be a danger to others, particularly to elderly women, and she would never feel genuine regret for what she had done. The case of Juana Barraza forces us to confront some of the most uncomfortable and disturbing truths about the relationship between childhood trauma and adult violence. Her story demonstrates how victimization can sometimes create victimizers, how abuse can transform innocent children into dangerous predators, and how society's failures to protect the vulnerable can create monsters who then prey on society's most defenseless members. But Juana's case also challenges simplistic explanations about the causes of serial killing. Thousands of children suffer abuse similar to what she experienced without becoming killers. The transformation from victim to predator requires a complex combination of factors: genetic predisposition, environmental influences, psychological development, and individual choices that we still don't fully understand. Her victims were elderly women who had already survived decades of life's challenges and hardships, only to be murdered by someone who exploited their loneliness and vulnerability. They trusted Juana because she represented exactly what they needed most: someone who cared about their welfare and offered practical help with their daily struggles. Instead, they found themselves face to face with a killer whose own traumatic past had transformed her into something monstrous. The tragedy of Juana's crimes extends far beyond the individual murders, to encompass the broader impact her actions had on Mexico City's elderly population. Her killing spree created a climate of fear that fundamentally changed how older people lived their daily lives. Elderly women became afraid to open their doors to strangers. Families worried constantly about their aging relatives, and the simple act of offering help to seniors became fraught with suspicion. The investigation that eventually brought Juana to justice revealed serious gaps in how society protects its most vulnerable members. Many of her victims came from marginalized communities where police presence was minimal and social services were inadequate. If these women had had better support systems and more regular contact with family and community members, Juana's crimes might have been detected much sooner. Her case also highlights the importance of recognizing that violence can come from unexpected sources. The assumption that serial killers are typically young men led investigators to overlook obvious clues and allowed Juana to continue killing for years longer than she might have otherwise. The idea that a middle-aged female wrestler could be systematically murdering elderly women was so far outside investigators' expectations that they dismissed evidence that should have led them to her much sooner. Today, Juana Barraza remains in prison, now an elderly woman herself, whose killing days are finally behind her. She continues to maintain that her actions were justified and that she was simply dealing with her own psychological pain in the only way she knew how. The wrestler who once entertained crowds with theatrical violence has been replaced by an aging convict who will never again have the chance to hurt anyone. Her story serves as a powerful reminder that evil can emerge from the most unexpected places, and that the people we trust to help us can sometimes be the greatest threats to our safety. It teaches us to be aware of our own vulnerability and the vulnerability of those we love, while also recognizing that the search for human connection and help, while natural and necessary, can also make us targets for those who would exploit our deepest needs. The elderly women who died at the hands of Juana Barraza will never have the chance to enjoy their final years in peace, to spend time with their families, or to pass on their wisdom and experiences to younger generations. Their deaths remind us that in a world where predators like Juana exist, we all have a responsibility to watch out for each other and to create systems that truly protect the vulnerable, rather than simply punishing the guilty after it's too late. The Lady of Silence may be behind bars, but her legacy lives on in the fear she created, the lives she destroyed, and the families she shattered. Her case stands as a testament to the importance of protecting the elderly, the complexity of human psychology, and the terrible price we pay when childhood trauma is allowed to fester and transform victims into victimizers. If this story opened your eyes to the vulnerability of elderly people and the importance of protecting them from those who would exploit their trust, share it with others who need to understand how predators operate and how we can better safeguard our most vulnerable community members. The fight to protect the innocent continues, and it requires all of us to remain vigilant against those who would use our compassion and trust as weapons against us.